Hi. My phone's battery right now is only 9%, and yeah, I'm pretty sure that I won't be able to make a very long video on this book this time. But let's take this as a challenge because I have this tendency to ramble a lot. And I don't think that I can afford to ramble too much before my phone dies this time. So yeah, hopefully this video is going to be a bit more succinct, a bit more concise. you know, those are not my strength. Anyway, I just, this was actually my second book of 2022, Faces in the Water by Janet Frame. I love this book, and Janet Frame she was a New Zealand author, and this book was published sometime in the 60s. I think it's 1961. So the edition that I have right here is the Virago Modern Classics, and it has this really, really beautiful cover with this really subtle image of images of faces in ripples. It's really beautiful, and it's sort of makes me want to read this even more because I find that this cover is so intriguing. And yeah, I actually started last year, but then it was really slow. This book is one book that I would consider to be a quiet book, a slow book. So if you're in a slumpy mood, this book might not be really appropriate for that. But if you are in higher spirits, and I would definitely suggest that because the subject in this book is pretty melancholic. It's kind of depressing. If you're not really in a cheerful state of mind, I would suggest you to try reading this book when you are, when you feel a bit better. So yeah. What is it about? So in Faces in the Water, we see this main character. Her name is Istina Mavet, and starting, in the beginning of this book, we see her as a 20-year-old who is in a psychiatric hospital in New Zealand, and we sort of follows her life as she is being put at different wards at that particular psychiatric hospital, and then later being placed to a different psychiatric hospital, and then being shifted around between wards as well. Basically, her life in this book, this book spans about 8 years. It's pretty much about how Istina moves around this psychiatric hospital institute, and how she sort of explores the different sides, different wards of psychiatric hospitals, and in the process have some reflective moments on herself, and it also shows how Istina views the staff in the psychiatric hospital, and also her fellow patients as well, the kinds of reflections that she makes on all of these observations. And I feel that this book is a very intimate novel. It's very personal, and yeah, it's overall, I would say that it's a very wonderful read, a very calm and peaceful read, if you don't really count all of the more melancholic and sad portions of this book. So yeah, this book, it's about mental health, and I think that one of the strengths of this book this is the part that I really love, is that this book writes mental health in such a way that it does not romanticize mental health and mental illness, and I think that is really important. I'm aware that many other good books do this also, and I really appreciate that fact. And this book certainly I would say this is kind of like an example of a book that really shows how you can write mental illness and also the psychiatric ward environment. Now, something about the psychiatric hospital in this book. Because this book was written in the first half of the 20th century, it also sort of portrays the psychiatric hospital and the medical treatments given to mental health patients at the time, based on what was existing at that time. And so it is safe to say that many of the things portrayed in here, the treatments, aren't exactly things that we as modern society would consider to be appropriate for the mental health patients. We're talking about really invasive treatments like lobotomy, and also what else? ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. And even though these treatments sort of exist right now, in this book it is sort of portrayed, those two things are sort of portrayed as the go-to treatment for patients who are simply too much, are considered to be as too sick in their head. And it sort of becomes like a running theme in this book. The presence of those treatments becomes something of a ghost in this book, a ghost that is always haunting the main character Istina, because Istina eventually becomes she develops fear towards these treatments, because these treatments are they are invasive and they are painful, and they sort of change who you are physically, temporarily, or even permanently, in terms of personality. And Istina eventually becomes more and more afraid of it, and it sort of culminates into this one moment in which Istina does something that is quite extreme, as a result of this fear for these treatments. And when she does that, another thing that happens, which is also kind of so-called makes sense because of how mental illness was understood at that time, is how the staff and other people around Istina sort of finds her to be, especially the staff, they find her to be uncooperative when she reacts in a rather unpleasant way towards these treatments. And there is a lot of portrayals of lack of empathy in this book, lack of understanding towards mental illness, which I think is it was probably, you can probably say that it was prevalent at that time, but I still think that in our current society there's that thing is still quite prevalent. The lack of knowledge and understanding and empathy towards mental health sufferers, mental illness sufferers, those things still exist. And I would say that this book up until today still feels relevant, even though much of the things that happen in this book can be sort of considered as a relic. Much of the attitudes can be considered as relics of of time that was very much in the past. But I still think that much of the elements in this book remains somewhat fresh even up to this day. And talking about how this book does not romanticize mental health and mental illness, there is actually one passage that I really want to share because I really love it. So here it is. There is an aspect of madness which is seldom mentioned in fiction because it would damage the romantic popular idea of the insane as a person whose speech appeals as immediately poetic. But it is seldom the easy Opheliana recited like the pages of a seed catalogue, or the outpourings of crazy Janes who provide, in fiction, an outlet for poetic abandon. Few of the people who roam the day room would have qualified as acceptable heroines in popular taste. Few were charmingly uninhibited eccentrics. The mass provoked mostly irritation, hostility, and impatience. Their behavior affronted caused uneasiness. They wept and moaned, they quarreled and complained. They were a nuisance and were treated as such. It was forgotten that they too possessed a prized humanity which needed care and love, that a tiny poetic essence could be distilled from their overflowing squalid truth. And I really love this passage because it really, it is one passage that sort of shows like how people who suffers from mental health issues, for one thing, they're just people, and like people, what they're experiencing are personal, and there is not much to be romanticized, just like regular people. Like, mental health and mental illness is just something that someone experiences inside themselves, and mental illness is unpleasant, and there is nothing edgy, there is nothing romantic about it. It is unpleasant. I don't know how else one can really describe it. It sucks, And I think that even up till this day, people have this sort of distorted view on certain mental illness that, the public does not really understand very much. And I feel that, it's really important to keep on pushing the fact that a mental illness is just it just sucks. That's it. That's what it is. It sucks, and it needs treatment, and it needs support, needs help. And also another thing about this book is I really like how it also shows like when someone is suffering from mental health, and when that person is being sort of committed to a psychiatric hospital. It sort of highlights this loss of control, loss of autonomy, so to speak. And for one thing, when you are suffering from certain kinds of mental illness, you already it's safe to say that you already lose some kind of control over yourself. Because it's not like you can control how you feel at any given time, especially when your mental illness strikes. And like I said, mental illness is really unpleasant. So when it strikes, you feel unpleasant, and it's not like you can choose to feel unpleasant or not. And already from that, you lose some kind of control over yourself. And I don't know, I just feel like this is a really common sense kind of a thing to say. But when the patient is being committed to a psychiatric unit, even up until this day, when the treatment is much better compared to what is being shown in this book, there is still a level of loss of control, loss of autonomy when one person is warded in a psychiatric unit. And I think another thing about this book is that I must say that it's, hashtag relatable, because I myself have been to a psychiatric unit. So there is some kind of familiarity when it comes to this feeling of loss of control that is being, portrayed and explored in this book. And it's just really fun to see that being shown in something that you read. And when it comes to mental health, I think that that part is something that probably not many people really think about, because I guess many people would sort of see mental health as something that happens in to another person based on how they look like outside. What the so-called patient is exuding, what they are showing outwardly, and those are the things that we can we would usually associate with particular mental health issues. Like, for example, someone with depression, they would be almost always in low energy and lack of interest and stuff like that. But this book is really intimate. It really shows you that what what really goes on inside a person. And the narrator of this book is Tina. This book is narrated in first person. Is Tina herself, as we read her narration of her own story and what happens in the psychiatric units, what happens to other patients, how she describes the patients, and also the staff, we sort of get this sense that Istina sounds like a very normal person, and really you don't really feel like you're reading a book about that is being narrated by a so-called mad woman. And in fact, I don't really want to use the word mad woman, because when you read this book, you don't feel like you're reading an account of someone who is considered as quote-unquote mad. And it is ridiculous. I think that label is really ridiculous, because when you read this, you feel like Istina is just like normal person. It's like yourself. It's like another person that you have in your in real life. You feel like there is nothing wrong with Istina, and you can pretty much what you can surmise by reading her narrative is that she is stressed out living in that condition. She's stressed out. She is afraid over the fact that she might be subjected to ECT or lobotomy. She is agitated. Overall, she's just feeling all of these unpleasant emotions. But at the same time, she also feels like a very strong character as well. She sort of perseveres, even though she has been like, in this entire book, she is staying at psychiatric hospitals, and those are the vibes that you get from this narrator, and so it's kind of strange, when you look at it from a different point of view and think about, hey, this character is actually a patient in a psychiatric unit, but she sounds normal. She sounds normal, and I think that's really important. And from my own personal experience as well, being in a psychiatric unit, the people that you see in there are also quite normal, just like the people that you would see outside. Probably because the environment of the psychiatric unit itself, and this is also another thing that this book talks about, is that the environment of a psychiatric unit, for one thing, it is in fact controlling. Like, you can't just simply go in and out of a psychiatric ward anytime you want. Like, you don't have that much freedom in there. You already lose a bit of control over yourself and what you want to do in there. And because of that kind of restriction that is being placed, it sort of becomes like a bubble, kind of like a tiny society within the confines of the walls of the psychiatric hospital and also the psychiatric ward. And with the formation of such society, a tiny society, you can expect hierarchy, you can expect power dynamics between staff and patients, and it's not always simple. Okay, so that was so rude of my phone to just die like that. Like, seriously, can you at least say something before dying? Okay, just picking up where I was cut off very rudely earlier. The society of within the confines of a psychiatric unit, it's not always simple, and it can be quite complicated, and it's sort of just as complicated as the kind of society that you see beyond the walls of the psychiatric unit, and maybe even has its own sort of flavor now that the members of the society sort of you have like a big portion of them really are much more open about showing their personal conditions, the patients especially. So it certainly is quite interesting dynamics that you would witness with inside a psychiatric ward, and I feel that this book shows that really wonderfully. So I think that's all that I'm going to say about this book. I feel that this is a really wonderful exploration in terms of what mental health and mental illness can entail in a setting that is much in the past, and very much different from how we view mental health and mental illness these days. And but at the same time, there are also many elements of regarding mental health that are still quite fresh and relevant these days as well. So it's a really empathetic kind of writing. I think it is compassionate, but most of all, it is intimate. And this book is sort of being kind of like touted as a story told by a mad woman, and again, I don't like that label, but it's the voice that you're hearing in this book is a very human voice, and I think that says a lot when it comes to what we think of mental illness and how we view mental health patients. So that's it for the book talk for Faces in the Water. If you have any opportunity to try this book, go ahead. I strongly recommend it. Trigger warning, of course, mental illness, different aspects of mental illness, depression, anxiety, and also there are portrayals of violence here in this book as well. There are portrayals of blood and quite unpleasant mental health treatments like lobotomy and ECT as well. So but if you are interested in trying this book, go ahead. And I'm gonna stop here. I'll see you again in a different video. So until then, take care. Thanks for watching, and bye.